Good afternoon. I'm Paul DiRienzo, host of The Torch. The Beats were a group of poets and writers that established a new way of writing and a new type of cultural norm in the 1940s and 50s that foreshadowed the cultural earthquakes of the 1960s that are still with us today. A trio of writers, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and William Burroughs, were brought together by Lucien Carr, all young Columbia students who wanted to create a new style of writing in the post-war years. But until now, one of their number, who had by her own desire been kept out of the spotlight, is being rediscovered. Alene Lee was an African-American woman who was a lover and longtime friend of Kerouac, his peer, according to her daughter, Christina Diamonte. Lee, who died of an aggressive form of lung cancer in 1991, had asked her daughter to make her story public to keep her alive after death. Diamante spoke with WBAI and described what it was like for her mother, as Black Native American, to exist in a world where women and women of color were often undervalued, even by relatively progressive men.
These were environments where there were Black people interacting with white people, which really didn't probably happen very much in the suburban or kind of middle-class backgrounds that Kerouac and Ginsberg came from, and in the case of Lucien Carr, a very wealthy, upper-class St. Louis family. So they had relationships with a lot of people, and Lucien, being a newsman, had a wide assortment of friends who were porters, and he spent quite a bit of time in local bars and restaurants and cafes, as they all did, and there was a wide assortment of people there. James Baldwin was one of my mother's friends and their friends, in Mamu, Miri Baraka, Leroy Jones, and there were not, I would say, an overabundance of Black people, but Black people were there, and it was not, I think it was part of what they were looking for, was to seek other experiences. However, this came out in a very nasty and unpleasant way in the book The Subterraneans, where in one particular portion of the book, Jack is thinking about Alene. They've just made love, and she's lying there sleeping, and he is filled with a sudden sense of repulsion because she has fuzzy hair on a piece of white cotton has stuck in her hair, and he realizes, I can't bring this Black girl home to my French mother. This won't do. And earlier in the book, Allen Ginsberg is quoted by Jack as also saying something very similar, like, I could never marry her, without exactly saying why. But, actually, he does say she's Black. I believe he says that. So these were very hurtful things. How they came to break those barriers is in part, I think, because they were living hard, playing hard and working hard, and my mother was not a Black person. In fact, she writes in her own writing, she writes, there were no Black people in the 40s and 50s or 30s. In fact, there were Negroes or colored people, and she was not interested in being part of a culture of this or that. She wanted to be around bright people, intelligent people, people who had things to discuss, people who read, people who were interested in culture. And she was according to Lucien, the intellectual equal of any of them, and could hold her own in that environment. She had relationships of friendship and involvement with them, and I think there were, maybe not necessarily all that many interracial relationships going on, but certainly some.
Alene was a talented poet on her own, her daughter reads.
What do you want to do when you grow up? She asked anew. I want to perpetuate the 4 seasons and promote conflict and strife for the proper meeting time to make a perfect day in June. We can't export the midnight sun. They give us sodium lights. The sound of October is music within my ears, giving rest, pause. The month breathes. This is done before winter's tumult. The last words she said to me on her deathbed were, and she woke up out of a semi-conscious state, she said, Christine, I want you to do whatever you can to help keep me alive. And as I write in my thesis, she may literally have just meant help physically keep me alive. However, she knew that she had a terminal cancer, lung cancer diagnosis, and that she would die. So in order, my attempt to process what she asked me to do, which was impossible, was to interpret it as, I can keep you alive forever if I can get your works published and let people know who you were and put you back into the history of the Beat era and also into the history in general.
Why was she written out or not included in the history of the Beat generation?
Well, for the reasons that you mentioned, she was a very private person, but she first came to be in the public eye when Jack Kerouac wrote about her in his Romana Clef, The Subterraneans. And in a Romana Clef, the author is writing about real people he knows and real things that happen with some, mechanisms for disguising them to a certain degree. And also the author is writing it from his or her perspective and may not actually reflect the real feelings of the people he's writing about. So when he wrote about her, he wrote about his love for her, his love affair with her, and the actual sex. And he came to her in the village after he had gotten it accepted with the help of Allen Ginsberg for publication. She said, like a cat who had brought a dead mouse in and was very proud. He was very proud and happy and thought she would be as well. However, when she read it and saw the detail of the intimate scenes, the relations between them, the sexual relations, and also his interpretation or remembrance of things that she'd said was not exactly accurate, she became worried and asked him to please change the race of the person he was writing about from African American and Native American to something else. And he did subsequently change it to a white person, which was later played by Leslie Caron in the movie The Subterraneans, which was, at that time, the only novel of his that ever, or work of his that ever had been a movie. It's the only Hollywood-level movie. But for years after the book was written, my mother was still living in Greenwich Village, which was a very provincial, small little area at that time. And the people who lived there knew each other fairly well. They were all part of the same kind of social group and literary group and coffee shop group and drinking group and artists and writers. And people would walk up to her, some of them, and also just some people that she didn't even know would walk up and say, "You're a Mardou. Jack Kerouac wrote about you." And they would literally confront her in the street, and she felt very exposed and vulnerable, and I think as anybody might in the late 1950s, feel very vulnerable if people were reading a book about your intimate sexual relations with a man that you loved. It wasn't exactly a normal thing to have happen to you, and this was happening to her over and over again. So from that point of view, she wanted very much to have privacy and not have, when the kind of authors that began pursuing her in the 70s and 80s, she wanted not to be mentioned by name so that she could avoid, perhaps, so that she could avoid those kinds of situations again. I will also say, however, she wanted privacy because my stepfather, or so I was told to call him, Lucien Carr, with whom she lived for 11 years, was also one of the subjects of Jack Kerouac's novels. He was in The Subterraneans and several other books as well. They have now made a movie about him subsequently. I do not know the name of it. You may be aware of it, but I have never seen it. But he was more so than Alene. Really, they were living together, and he was very interested in privacy because, of course, Jack Kerouac was writing about a situation in which Lucien had murdered someone. Now, he was convicted of manslaughter, not of murder, but, he was working after he left prison as a copy boy at United Press International in the Daily News building, and then worked his way along until he eventually became an international editor at UPI. And he very much did not want to have his whole past dredged out and rehashed, and he wanted to have control to whatever extent was possible of what was said about him in these books. Two of the authors that I'm aware of who wrote books were Barry Gifford and Lee. I cannot remember Lee's first name or the book that they wrote. It might be Jack's book. And the other was Gerald Nicosia, who wrote Memory Babe. So what my mother decided to do in order to aid Lucian's attempt to gain privacy and hers as well was that she would, and also Ann Charters, she learned a lesson with Ann Charters, who had written a book about Jack Kerouac, one of the first to sort of become well-known. And that lesson was that if she didn't have control over what was said, all kinds of things might be said about her that were not necessarily really reflective of who she was. So by the time it got to the Gifford and Lee book and the Nicosia book, she had agreed to do interviews with them, but only under the condition that she could keep the tapes and transcribe them, so that if she had misspoken or said something inaccurate, perhaps she could, correct or edit it when she handed in the drafts of the tapes, the transcriptions of the tapes.
Now, didn't Ann Charters in her book refer to Alene as, not by name, but in a somewhat insulting manner? Yes,
as the quote-unquote the black girl.
What was it like? Let's take that off. I want to take from there a little bit, because Alene Lee, Jack Kerouac was not a liberal person. He was a man of his time. He was a patriot, and probably agreed with a lot of the things that I would disagree with were happening in the 50s, although he was a great writer, and that's not an unusual circumstance. So how was it that that their relationship between an old line guy from the day and a young black woman could work out at all in that era?
Well, Jack Kerouac, Lucien Carr, and Allen Ginsberg all met at Columbia University, and they all three of them conceived of this new literature that they were interested in trying to develop. It was based in part on the writings of Rimbaud. I believe it's spelled Rimbaud, and it had to do with the degradation of humanity and experiencing the degradation of humanity yourself before you could become a good writer. So I'm not saying that that's why he had a relationship with my mother, but they all plunged themselves specifically and purposely into situations that were not what you would call your typical white middle-class American dream scenarios. Whether or not that is why or how they became involved with the quote-unquote beats in Greenwich Village in the late 40s and 50s is unknown to me. However, they did drift down there and became part of a larger group of people, writers, artists, who were very intellectual and interested in different experiences. They were not seeking the quote-unquote Madison Avenue American dream. They were looking for a different, you might say, a deeper meaning in life. And, these were environments where there were black people interacting with white people, which really didn't probably happen very much in the suburban or kind of middle-class backgrounds that Kerouac and Ginsberg came from, and in the case of Lucien Carr, a very wealthy upper-class St. Louis family. So they had relationships with a lot of people, and Lucien, being a newsman, had a wide assortment of friends who were porters, and he spent quite a bit of time in local bars and restaurants and cafes, as they all did, and there was a wide assortment of people there. James Baldwin was one of my mother's friends, and their friends in Mamou, Miri Baraka, Leroy Jones, and there were not, I would say, an overabundance of black people, but black people were there, and it was not, I think it was part of what they were looking for was to seek other experiences. However, this came out in a very nasty and unpleasant way in the book The Subterraneans, where in one particular portion of the book, Jack is thinking about Alene. They've just made love, and she's lying there sleeping, and he is filled with a sudden sense of repulsion because she has fuzzy hair on a piece of white cotton has stuck in her hair, and he realizes, I can't bring this black girl home to my French mother. This won't do. And earlier in the book, Allen Ginsberg is quoted by Jack as also saying something very similar, like, I could never marry her, without exactly saying why. But, actually, he does say she's black. I believe he says that. So these were very hurtful things. How they came to break those barriers is in part, I think, because they were living hard, playing hard, and working hard. And my mother was not a black person. In fact, she writes in her own writing, she writes, there were no black people in the 40s and 50s or 30s. In fact, there were Negroes or colored people, and she was not interested in being part of a culture of this or that. She wanted to be around bright people, intelligent people, people who had things to discuss, people who read, people who were interested in culture. And she was according to Lucien, the intellectual equal of any of them, and could hold her own in that environment. She had relationships of friendship and involvement with them, and I think there were, maybe not necessarily all that many interracial relationships going on, but certainly some.
It's
I don't know. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, sort of. How long were they? How long were they together? When they were together, when were they together? And for how long?
Well, this would be slightly before the publishing of the book, which I believe was in 55. However, I could be off on that.
I have 1958 for the Subterraneans.
Okay. So it would have been prior to that and prior to me being born. I was born in 57. But when he presented it to her, yes, I had already been born. So I don't know how long they were together. Nobody ever mentions exactly in any of the transcriptions that she typed how long she was with Kerouac. However, she knew him for many years, for I'd say over 2 decades from the time she first met him at, I believe it was the San Remo. She was introduced to him by Allen Ginsberg.
And where tell me a little bit about your mom's history. Where was she born, and how did she get to New York City? Was she from New York?
She was originally born Eileen Garris in Washington, D.C., and her mother, Mamie, fled Washington, D.C. She had been married to a World War I veteran, actually. My mother was born in 1930, who had, what did they call it? Shell-shocked. Yes, he was shell-shocked. And so apparently there was some violence there, and Mamie left and took the whole family to Staten Island. So my mother was raised in Staten Island, in the Richmond area of Staten Island. I believe it's Richmond. It could be Richmondville, right off of the ferry. After you exit the ferry, it's one of the first neighborhoods you would run into. Mm-hmm. And then she left Staten Island at age 16, and I won't say ran away, but she did sort of run away to Greenwich Village.
I see. And it was easier to get for a 16-year-old to get an apartment or find a place to live in those days?
Well, I think she ended up going to the YMCA Women's Center, and I believe that was located near or at Gramercy Park. And so they had cheap rooms, and a lot of young ladies were there from all over the country who had a variety of reasons for going to New York City. And I think that her first experience there was a pretty good one because it was fairly affordable, and she had lots of friends there that were interested in the same kinds of cultural things she was interested in. However, subsequently, when she left there, she had, and I don't have it in front of me right now, a list of, I think, over 30 apartments that she'd had in Greenwich Village over a 10, 15, 20-year period. So while it wasn't difficult to get the apartments, it was apparently somewhat difficult for her as a person who hadn't finished high school to actually be able to afford to keep them. So, and then as a single mom, she struggled economically as well.
I see. And so her, what did she eventually, what did she do to keep body and soul together at the same time she was carousing with the Beat Generation?
Well, shortly after she came to Manhattan, she met Virginia Admiral, who is the mother of the actor Robert De Niro, and she had a typing service called Admiral Typing. Virginia, as I mentioned in the presentation, was actually the first female artist to have her artworks displayed at MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art. But she, like Alene, had, she was a single mom raising her son, Robert De Niro, alone, and she started this typing business. And Alene came to meet her. I'm not sure how, but she ended up working for Virginia, and Virginia ended up becoming her closest lifelong friend. In fact, Virginia is my godmother, was my godmother. She's deceased now. And she was somewhat instrumental in my being born, because she was always trying to convince my mother that she would be a great mother. So Virginia eventually expanded her business. Admiral Typing was on off of 14th Street, I believe, on 8th Avenue. And my mom started her own typing business, which Virginia aided her with by siphoning off some of the smaller jobs that she didn't want. And Alene did a lot of dissertations and thesis work for a wide variety of people from all the numerous colleges and universities in New York, Columbia, NYU, on and on, the New School. So she ran a typing business of her own for many years. She eventually got an office at Abington Square. Oh, actually, at Sheridan Square. It was called Sheridan Square Typing.
I see. And looking back, just to wrap up now, looking back, how did she talk to you about her experience with the Beat Generation people, and as a part of that, what did she learn from it, and what did they learn from her?
I don't think my mother thought in those terms. She probably learned a lot. She did write in one of her journal entries that she learned to be very careful what you said to writers. But I believe that she was really more of a peer of theirs. She wasn't someone who needed to learn anything from them particularly. I think it was a pretty mutual relationship. In retrospect, she wrote a lot about Jack and about various people in the Beat era, and mentioned that the particular experience she had with Jack was very painful. It was very painful to have a relationship break up in the way that one did, and then to become a source of public discussion for a large number of people. She was very, very angry at him. She writes in one of her journal entries, I am angry at him, at the dead him. So I think it was something that she didn't ever necessarily recover from. However, she did and was able to forgive him and talk about him in a way without anger, realizing years later that, he was just who he was. So I don't think she actually harbored anger, but when she would think about the situation that had occurred, she would be angry.
What was it that made her most angry, and how did they break up?
Well, I think that she, being a private person, was most angry at having sexual relations between her and another person discussed in public, basically without her permission. I think she also was angry at the racist comments that Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac made in the book. And I think that she felt that they were all friends who should have sort of treated each other better.
I see. How did they break up?
That's in the book. Jack realized that she was not going to be his quote-unquote meek Blake woman, and he was apparently trying to devise a way to break up with her so he could hurry up, rush home, Alene writes, and write about their relationship. So I think what she says is that they broke up finally when he came to her door with the manuscript. And then she realized she could not have a relationship with him if this was the way it was going to be. Technically, he stopped seeing her prior to the publishing of the book and prior to the writing of the book, pardon me, not the publishing, the writing of the book, after he left her to go to some party or other, I think it was with Gore Vidal, and just put her in a cab and closed the door and said, I'm going back to the bar. He did a couple of other things which were very hurtful, which is something maybe I don't necessarily want to discuss, but I will just say he became involved with other people and she became involved with another person in a way that wasn't really particularly meaningful to her, because you have to realize this whole group of people had a different attitude about sexual relations. Many of the people in the Beat era, certainly the published authors and Burroughs and Ginsberg and even Kerouac, were either homosexual or bisexual, but they were living in a world where they could not necessarily discuss. Certainly they probably couldn't discuss openly at that time this situation or even explore it. So it took many of them many years to quote unquote come out. But Alene didn't perceive that as being a problem. She was a different kind of a person who didn't have a homophobic bone in her body. And I don't think she maybe looked at sexuality as a more fluid thing. And if she loved someone, it didn't matter to her what they were. Clearly, Kerouac was bisexual, at least, as written in his book, his relationship with I believe it was Gord Vidal, but she could have forgiven him for that more than writing the book. From his perspective, it may have been when she first had a relationship with another a member of their group, whom I have been asked never to mention the name of, because whether he's deceased or not, apparently there was a real falling out between the two. And I might mention in print, but I don't want to do anything to disturb this person, so I won't mention them in this particular interview, but it's in the book. So if you have the key, there are numerous authors who have written keys indicating who is who in the book, what he calls them, and who they actually are. So actually, Jack writes about that in the book, about him planning for her to have this relationship with this other fellow, and then that would be the catalyst by which he could just say, goodbye. But he didn't say goodbye in the final sense. They remained friends and acquaintances for years. She lived with one of his best, if not his best friend, Lucien Carr, 11 years after that.
We dedicate this evening's news to the story of Jasmine Headley, who is currently in Rikers Island jail. She was arrested after her child was ripped from her by NYPD and HRA officers. The video of the incident has gone viral worldwide. I'm Paul DiRienzo with the WBAI Evening News for Tuesday, December 11th, 2018. Criminal charges have been dropped against Jasmine Headley, a 23-year-old mother who is subject of a brutal viral video, but she remains jailed on Rikers Island. In the video, filmed last Friday at a Human Resources Administration facility in Brooklyn, Headley is captured lying on the floor as 4 NYPD officers rip her 1-year-old baby from her arms. NYPD arrested Headley and charged her with resisting arrest, obstruction, trespassing, and harming her own child. Before police confronted her, Headley had been sitting on the floor of the HRA office because there were no available seats. Headley, who is employed, went to the HRA building that day because she needed daycare vouchers for her child. According to her attorney, it hasn't been made clear why her vouchers have been withheld. Brooklyn Defender Services Executive Director and founder Lisa Schreibersdorf spoke on the steps of City Hall today.
This is very upsetting to her, but that it has a bigger impact because it shed a light on something that maybe people don't know about. So I just want to say that, Brooklyn Defender Services represents about 30,000 people a year in cases where they're arrested, cases where their children are being taken from them, when they're being deported, and our clients also in, NYCHA, public, HRA, all of these resources and services that the City of New York provides to our clients. And when our clients go to these places to get help, they are often treated so less than. They are treated that they are really not human. They are not people. That they are somehow, not even worthy of the time and respect that they actually do deserve. And I will tell you, for Jasmine had a job. Jasmine wanted to work. She said, all I want to do is be able to go to work. Her child was in daycare, just like my child was in daycare when I went to work. And they were paying it, and nobody advised her that they were cutting off her benefit. She found out because they just stopped sending the check. She doesn't know why. Still to this day, we don't know why. The child care worker doesn't know why. She had to go there to find out why, and she's there for 4 hours. And I don't know who's saying she should have just stood up, because I haven't seen that. I'm glad I haven't seen that, because that would really anger me.
That's right.
But I will tell you that she was just sitting peacefully. Every witness who was there, everybody who saw it, the part before the video, she was just sitting on the floor with her baby. And, people are talking about de-escalation. There was never any escalation here. This is not a person that was acting distressed, acting out. She was just sitting there and needed to sit down. I just want to thank everybody for coming forward and supporting Jasmine personally. And I really look forward to exploring some of the issues that are being brought up. And I think this is an opportunity to really look at the way people are treated at these agencies, and also when they call the police and what the police do when they are called. All of this needs to be looked at, and I hope that this story doesn't die out. I have to leave now because I'm going to go to court right now, see if I can get a judge to release her. Yes. And I'm hoping that that works out. She's in Rikers Island right now because of a New Jersey matter. She was in a car with 4 people, and one of them had some stolen credit cards, not her. She was released. She was 20 years old. She was released at that time directly from the precinct or soon thereafter. I'm not that familiar with the New Jersey process. Trenton, New Jersey. She was never in New Jersey in her life. She is a Brooklyn girl, and she came home and didn't really understand that she needs to go back or where to go or anything like that. Okay, that because of that, a warrant was issued. When she came through court in Brooklyn, that is called an extradition because it's in another state. Because it's an extradition, she was being held on that. It sounds very serious, like it's another country, but it's not. Because of that, there is a provision in the law that allows the judge to release her on an extradition. We are asking the judge to implement that procedure this afternoon. Yes. He's going to hear us at 2 o'clock, hopefully calendar that argument for later today. If that doesn't work out, New Jersey is scheduled to come pick her up tomorrow morning and bring her to New Jersey. Okay, right now, we hope that when she gets to New Jersey, that the judge over there believes that she should be released. And I'm working now to get her an attorney. There have been many offers of pro bono attorneys. There's been an incredible outpouring of support, which, Jasmine doesn't even really know about, but I'm trying to make sure that she gets the best representation. And I know a lot of people want to help her. I know there's a lot of stuff going on in GoFundMe. I don't want to minimize this, but she needs to pay the babysitter, and she needs to pay her rent when she gets out. And please don't go on any GoFundMe sites except the one we put up, because I know that will go to her. They can indicate that they're not interested in picking her up. They can let everybody know that they don't want to press these charges. Absolutely. And I hope they do. I hope they do it right now or as soon as possible.
Lisa Schreibersdorf is director of Brooklyn Defender Services. Headley is being held at Rikers Island without bail because of an open warrant from Mercer County, New Jersey that occurred 2 years ago. Allegedly, Headley was in a car stopped by police where stolen credit cards were found. The cards were not in Headley's possession, and she was released, unaware she had to return to a court date. Public advocate Letitia James, who is the Attorney General-elect of New York State, says it was the security officers at HRA who were wrong in letting the situation escalate.
My office has been in touch with Mercer County, and we ask that they come and either have the warrant dismissed or have her released on her own recognizance. First, let me thank Eric Gonzalez. A number of us have been in touch with the District Attorney of Brooklyn. We want to thank him for dismissing the charges. We also would hope that Mercer County would do the same. We would hope that they would dismiss it in the interest of justice or issue a ACD, an adjournment in contemplation of dismissal, and they can do just that. And so we hope that at 2 o'clock, the judge in Brooklyn will release her on her own so that she can go to Mercer County in New Jersey. I think it's important to understand that the reason why there was a fugitive warrant, an extradition warrant, is because she had missed 2 court cases. And it's because, again, she probably had limited means to get to New Jersey and had no idea the legal process in New Jersey. The bottom line is that this young woman is still in jail, and her child right now is confused and is missing their mother. And it's really critically important that she be released and be released today. This is certainly an injustice, but it raises a number of issues. The first issue is the issue of de-escalation doesn't apply to her. It should have applied to the police officers.
That's right.
I also want to say that it was not NYPD that escalated this. It was the police officers at HRA. If you look at the video, it was the officers or the security personnel at HRA who escalated this. And they are the individuals who obviously need training. 2, why did it take 4 hours for this one young woman to get assistance? It's my understanding, based on information and my experience dealing with a number of individuals who seek assistance from these agencies, that on average it takes 4 and 5 hours. 3, why do they not accommodate women with children, senior citizens, and others who are disabled? We need more chairs. The answer to this should not have been the police. The answer to this should have been a chair.
That's right.
Plain and simple. A chair. We needed someone who was an adult in the room to de-escalate this matter, to hold this woman, and to get a chair for this woman.
That's right.
Someone who was an adult, someone who was sensitive, someone who recognized that these individuals who go to HRR centers are suffering from a lot of stress. And so it's critically important that we have individuals who understand what is happening, and that this woman and her child were terrified.
That's right.
And so what we have in our society is the over-policing of communities of color and poor people. And as I said previously, poverty should not be a crime.
That's
I
right.
thank the Women's Caucus. I thank all of my elected officials. But this is not over. It raises a significant number of issues that need to be addressed both in the city and statewide. And I look forward to working with the elected officials to do just that. Thank you.
And Councilmember Inez Barron laid the blame on the NYPD, who she says have been committing these kind of unnecessary and brutal acts without accountability for decades.
And I'm also speaking on behalf of my husband, Assemblymember Charles Barron. Councilmember Donovan Richards echoed or pronounced the position that I have. Until there are consequences,
That's right.
especially for NYPD that act in a criminal manner, until there are appropriate consequences, we're going to continue to see this kind of behavior because it is systemic.
That's true.
All of the institutions here are racist, and they demonstrate that going back to the historic slavery that existed here. So until police receive the consequences for the crimes they commit, we're going to continue to see this because they can violate the law and nothing happens to them other than they lose vacation time. Punish the police, put them in jail, and fire them.
That's right.
And Vanessa Gibson is a city council person from the Bronx. She says Headley did nothing another mother would not have done to protect her child.
Councilmember Vanessa Gibson.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. I add my voice to all of my colleagues in government and just expressing our outrage as an African American, as a woman. It is just unacceptable that Jasmine had to endure this. Any mother would always go to the end of the earth to protect her child. And Jasmine did everything right, and we need to make sure that she is free and she can go back to work. She has a job. This woman took the day off to go in and access benefits. We have pushed for so many reforms in this city, and every time we have one of these incidents, we take 10 steps back. 10 steps back in the progress that we tried to make. And so we don't want Jasmine Headley to just be another hashtag, but this has to be a real transformative change in the way we do business. It should never be a crime to be poor in this city. And for too many women and mothers and women of color, it is a crime, and we are treated as such. And so we are outraged. This is unacceptable. We will not rest until Jasmine is reunited with her family and we talk about the larger issues. This woman should have been given a damn seat, a seat to sit down. The humanity in this society that we have lost, the people that were in this center that allowed a mother and her child to sit on the floor, the security guards that allowed this situation to escalate out of control, and the fact that they thought it was necessary to call 911. The police responded because they were called. They should have never been called in the first place. What does it mean when we don't know how to handle situations in our HRA centers? So this situation to me has been an absolute nightmare, traumatizing for a mother and for anyone with human dignity to watch that video. You would be inhumane not to be affected by this. It could have been any one of us, that's right, our sisters, our mothers, our aunts, our children. That's and right. So we have to stand for what is right. It is not a crime to be poor, and we're going to stand together and make sure Jasmine is released, and we make sure that we implement more reforms, because you cannot legislate morality and you cannot legislate common sense. Common sense is not that common, and we're going to continue to stand until we get the necessary reforms in this city. Thank you all.
And City Council member Donovan Richards is chair of the Public Safety Committee, which oversees the NYPD. He says police are never arrested or held accountable for their actions. He adds that these things happen because the city has made criminals out of poor people.
We need to ensure that there is a strong message that if you ever are part of actions like this, that you are fired. How many NYPD officers have been fired for these actions? Zero. You look at Garner. I hear everybody today, but we need people to stand with us when we are saying to this system, a person was jailed for sitting on the floor. That is not a crime. Why was the NYPD there? Why are black women and men and Latinos held at these centers for 3 and 4 hours? That is the crime here. That's right. That is the crime. We are criminalizing poverty, but we're also telling people that they don't matter because you're poor, because you need a Metro card, because you need child care. That is the bigger problem here. So until we address these systematic issues, I'm glad the press is here today. But there are a lot of people who don't catch these incidents on camera. These incidents are happening day in and day out. It's happened to my family members. It's happened to my constituents. Even as council staffers, we have to go down to these HRA offices because we can't get an answer from HRA on a case as city council members. So if we're going to truly be serious about reform, we need to address these systematic issues, and we need to hold the NYPD accountable for this as well. Thank you.
City Council member Donovan Richards. Andrea Ritchie is researcher in residence on race, gender, sexuality, and criminalization. She's the author of Invisible No More, Racial Profiling and Police Brutality Against Women and LGBTQ People of Color. She spoke with WBAI.
And what's happening here is what happens across the country in terms of how poor people are policed, about how black women are policed, how black mothers are policed, and the expectation that black women in particular will comply with, will fully comply and must comply on pain of punishment like this to any order, including an order to, move from the only place they can sit in an HRA office where they've been waiting for 4 hours with a 1-year-old. I mean, anyone who's a parent knows that sitting with a 1-year-old or being with a 1-year-old for 4 hours requires sitting down, requires the child to be able to sit down. If there's nowhere else to sit, then the floor is the only place. And this is certainly not something that warrants a police response. And so it's also representative of what's happening across the country in terms of police being, and criminalization and arrest being the default response to anything and everything, including the mere presence of black women, of black mothers in public spaces. She was charged with criminal trespass in a public space. She was charged, all the other charges came from what the police officers did to her for merely being in a place that she was entitled to be, to get benefits that she was entitled to, doing what society demands of black mothers, which is that, people, work and take care of their children. Here she was doing exactly what, she is being expected to do and being punished for it regardless, which is typical of how black mothers are treated in the United States, whether they're, doing what's expected or doing anything else, frankly, being in public spaces.
It's not something that you really even hear that happens in Europe. You don't hear about it happening in Asia. You hear about this happening in the United States constantly.
I mean, I'm sure it happens in those places where black people, where people of color, where people of African descent, where people who are immigrants, people who are poor are concerned. We happen to be living in the United States and in a place where people are increasingly documenting this kind of behavior on social media, so we're more aware of it. But it's, I think, in the United States, very much rooted in the legacy of chattel slavery, of black women being treated like they're not entitled to any of the benefits of personhood, of womanhood, of chivalry, of a chair in an office where they're waiting for things that they're entitled to, and of black mothers being treated with such a disregard. I mean, watching the police rip her child from her can't help but sort of call up images of children being ripped from black mothers during slavery, and that's just sort of a normalized behavior in this country that we wouldn't normalize or expect or tolerate when it happens to a mother of another race. We're seeing it happen at the border to immigrant women, to Latinx people, and we've seen it happen across history to women of color, and particularly to black women, and this is just a modern-day representation of that kind of punishment of black women for merely existing and, being waiting to receive basic entitlements, things that people are entitled to as a basic human right, like child care.
Does social class have something to do with this? The fact that she was in a Human Resources Administration office asking for a benefit of something, even though she was working class person herself?
Absolutely. I mean, this is how poverty is policed. This is how people who are low income, who are receiving government entitlements are treated. This is certainly not the first time I've heard of police violence against a black woman in an HRA office, in a welfare office. It's a frequent occurrence. Often there are frustrations expressed about waiting for hours, for days. If you're being expected to keep a job, if part of the condition of you receiving benefits is to keep a job, yet when you go to get the things that you need to keep the job, you're kept waiting for hours, and you might lose your job waiting for the things that you need to keep it. People get frustrated and, sometimes elevate voices. And when police are called in response to that and respond with this kind of violence, with this kind of brutality, with this kind of arrest and criminalization, it just further pushes people into poverty, completely, purely out of racism and anti-black racism specifically. So now Jasmine has been sitting on Rikers for 4 or 5 days away from her 1-year-old child. I can't imagine. I hope that her employer understands and doesn't take her job from her, but it would not be uncommon for this to result in the loss of employment. And this is something that happens to black women every single day who are just trying to navigate a system that's supposed to give them things that are basic human rights, basic entitlements. But this is how poverty is policed in the United States.
Now, most of the people, when I look at the video, not all, but most of the people involved, and this would be typical in an HRA office, are actually people of color. The security people are mostly people of color. There was a couple of white people there too. Why do people of color treat each other this way?
I think it's about systems and about how systems treat people. And so if you're an employee of a system, there's a way in which there's expectations, there's standards, there's norms that are set about how people who come to receive services, to receive things that they're entitled to at those offices are treated. And so really, it's sort of like police officers. Police officers of color also commit violence against black women and women of color every single day because that's what the system is set up to do. And when you're part of the system, that's the expectation, that's what the training is, and that's what the standard and the norm is, and that's the kind of enforcement that happens no matter who's doing the enforcement.
What can we do about this? Is there any way out of this? What is the way out?
I think we have to dramatically shift our understanding, one, of entitlements, and two, of people who receive them, like Jasmine. Jasmine's a mom. She's working. She's entitled to receive child care support, and so she's entitled to be in the office that she needs to go to, and she's entitled to not have to wait 4 hours to get it. She's entitled to receive it as easily, as quickly as possible so she can get back to the business of taking care of her child in her life. And so I think that's the first thing we do, is just shift the way we understand people who are receiving government assistance of any kind or entitlements of any kind. And two, we have to shift our response to every disagreement to being calling the police, because this is the result. This is consistently the natural outcome of that. And then the third thing we need to do is really shift our understanding of and the narratives that frame black women as undeserving, as bad mothers, as undeserving to be in public spaces, undeserving to express demand that they be treated with dignity, undeserving of basic respect and dignity. Those are the things that we need to shift in order to get at the root of this problem and stop this kind of thing from happening on a daily basis as it currently does.
You know, her attorney said that she gets the same benefit for her. You know, she's a director of the Brooklyn Defender Services and gets the same benefit that Jasmine Headley gets. A lot of women.
Yes, yet she's a white woman and doesn't, and gets it in a way that doesn't jeopardize her employment and doesn't lead to the police being called on her if she expresses frustration at having to sit on the floor because there's nowhere else to sit, or wait 4 hours to receive something she's entitled to.
Yeah, the conditions in these, and I'll leave you with this, the conditions in these offices is pretty much the same. You go to all of them, there's no care for the children. It's just push you through, and nobody cares. Nobody answers anything. If you ask any questions, you can get in trouble just for asking a question. You know, you're not allowed to ask questions. It's a real authority thing going on.
It's completely devoid of treating people with human dignity. So I think, going back to your original question of what's the answer to this, universal child care is the answer to this. Universal guaranteed minimum wage is the answer to this.
You've been listening to The Torch on the Progressive Radio Network. This program is heard each Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern on prn.fm. We cover news and analysis that goes beneath the surface to shine a light of truth on the dark recesses of our world. I'm your host, Paul DiRienzo, and you've been listening to The Torch.